If you are at all marginalised in this society, you experience ongoing, unending, insidious trauma. If you're a woman, if you're a person of colour, if you're disabled, if you're working class, if you're from the global south, if your first language isn't English. The number of people in this society who are untraumatised becomes a tiny minority. If everybody is traumatised, we need a better term and we need a better framework than that of individual trauma. The therapist who I described working with in the book, she would say to me, what you're describing is racism, and you don't have to be okay with racism. It's not your job to cope well with racism. It's the job of the world to stop being racist. And that's such a good example of therapeutic practice. Rather than being like, how do we fix you? That's how therapeutic practice can affirm your reality and say, you're not defective for reacting with distress to a distressing situation.
Welcome to Medicine Unheard. My name is Hamaad, and this is where healthcare workers change conversations around health and care. In today's episode, we're joined by Noreen Masud. Noreen is a talented writer and poet whose debut book, A Flat Place, explores the complexities of trauma, identity, and the profound connections between land and a sense of belonging. In this episode, we talk to Noreen about her personal experience with trauma and CPTSD, how it shaped her understanding of reality, and the relationship between colonial histories and cultural othering. We talk about the idea that it's not enough about being understood, but rather about being believed, and how we as healthcare workers can champion and be advocates for patient testimonies, particularly in psychiatric trauma, and how literature can serve as a resistance against the dehumanisation of marginalised communities. Noreen also challenges traditional notions of empathy, proposing a new model of solidarity that fosters understanding of our differences whilst championing new connections. This is quite simply one of the most extraordinary conversations I could ever hope to host at Medicine Unheard. So, let's begin by first understanding a bit more about Noreen.
My name is Noreen Masud. I'm a writer and academic. I work full-time teaching English literature at the University of Bristol, and as well as I'm also a lover of flat landscapes. I'm working on an academic book about flat landscapes, but I've also published a memoir travelogue called A Flat Place about flat landscapes and the way they make us feel, and my particular love for flat landscapes and what they mean to me personally. They give me a kind of language in the book for the experience of having had a strange life and the experience of strange relationships that I experience with people and with things. A flat landscape is a space which often as we look out, we don't really know how to relate to. A space with focal points like mountains or rivers. Our eyes know what to do. They know where to go. They start perhaps in the background and they move to the foreground. We know what journey we go on. We know the kinds of relationship that we can establish with a varied landscape. When we encounter a flat landscape, what we experience, I think, is a kind of crisis of relationship. We don't know what to focus on. We don't know how to look at it. And I think that might be one reason why people often express feelings of terror or panic or horror or disgust or boredom when it comes to flat landscapes. These are spaces that we do not know how to relate to. And that makes me really interested in this whole question of relationship. I've got a working diagnosis of complex post-traumatic stress disorder. Though as I discuss in the book, I don't accept that diagnosis fully at face value. I understand it as a useful term among many other terms. With that diagnosis, though, I find that flat landscapes give me a language for the experience of complex PTSD. And for me, that shows up perhaps most strongly in terms of my relationships with other people. Often feelings of numbness, finding relationships unrewarding, often feeling like other people are unreal, or like that we are fundamentally different and there is no kind of common ground we can find. And that sense of alienation feels mirrored to me by flat landscapes. Oddly and ironically, the bleakness perhaps, or the non-relationality of flat landscapes gives me a sense that I can relate, because I can relate to them.
Thank you so much, Noreen. And touching on your childhood experience and the trauma and perception that helped you reconcile with flat landscapes, both as a geographical phenomenon and I guess as a metaphor for the dampening effect that you describe as a feature of your complex post-traumatic stress disorder. You write in the book, "When I was growing up, I was constantly told that what I could see to be true wasn't true. And that was a big part of the CPTSD that resulted. Being told that the evidence of my own eyes I couldn't trust, and other people weren't trustworthy and were lying to me. So that has left me with a real passion for the real." I wonder if you can speak on that, your unique childhood experience, the trauma of it, and how you relate to it.
Absolutely. So I was born and raised in Lahore, in Pakistan, and specifically in a strange family in Lahore. I always have to stress this. My childhood was not a normal Pakistani childhood. There's a real readiness in our media to demonize Muslims or people with Muslim backgrounds and to attribute all trauma to Muslimness. And that has made it very, very hard for women of colour to speak up about their experiences. So it's always a distinction I want to make. While women of colour have said to me, I feel that you've captured some of my feelings that I had as a child, I want to stress that my childhood was odd for a Pakistani family. My father was very, very intelligent, very brilliant, very respected doctor with, what we might call megalomaniac tendencies. He had been told constantly how great he was, and he truly believed it. And he felt, I think, a sense of ownership of his 4 daughters. He had no sons, which was like, in that context, was a feeling that he had to manage. It was not necessarily culturally straightforward for him to only have 4 daughters. We weren't really allowed, we were strongly discouraged from speaking to people outside the household. We weren't allowed to visit friends' houses from school. We were discouraged from mixing with anyone except the immediate nuclear family. And so we stayed indoors, to the extent that even though I was born and raised in Pakistan, I didn't learn to speak Urdu. We were kept away from extended family, even, and neighbours. Well, I learned, my Urdu is very poor. I have really patchy Urdu. A lot of it was self-taught by reading things like Urdu poetry. So I can read Urdu poetry, but I would struggle to, have a conversation about the weather. And he was very interested, I think, because he had 4 girls, to cope with the emotions around having 4 girls. He was determined to optimize us and to make us as good as boys, quote unquote. And that involved a certain amount of experimentation, psychological experimentation, as well as medical experimentation. And one of the consequences of growing up in a place like Pakistan is that there isn't necessarily a great deal of social support if things at home are not right. So you are very much at the mercy of what your parents choose to do to you and with you. So that was the context I grew up in. And where the people who should have been a source of safety, like my father, were instead a source of risk and pain and fear. And yet he was not unusually violent. He was not unusually abusive. In terms of physical violence, it was I would say a normal level for, physical, child abuse is very, very common in Pakistan. It was not anything out of the ordinary in that respect. So there's a strange doubleness where I look back at my life and I feel like, it was very odd. And it has left a terrible mark on me. And yet at the same time, a voice says, well, compared to other people, nothing really happened to you. I remember the girls at my school coming in covered with the marks of having been beaten with wire coat hangers, with weapons, really. I remember girls being pulled out of school because they were suspected of talking to a boy. You live in a kind of climate of fear and risk. And there was certainly no way that I could describe what was happening to me at home that wouldn't be dismissed as just, just be a good girl and everything will be all right.
It's extraordinary also because you managed to not let that affect your relationship as a Pakistani too. You'd imagine that going through such a traumatic experience, there might be a lazy comparison, drawing the inevitability of your experience from the culture that you came from, and then just entirely disavowing and cleaving yourself from that Pakistani cultural context. How do you reconcile your identity as a Pakistani?
It's such a great question. I often say, when I talk about this book, A Flat Place, is that it's the story of my dehumanisation on 2 levels. And the first level, the one I've just been telling you about, is my dehumanisation at the hands of my father. because he thought of me as, and I say in the book, we are all making deals around the humanity of other people all the time. We all make deals about how consistently we allow other people's humanity to be present to us. So whenever we buy something on Amazon, we're temporarily allowing ourselves to forget the terrible conditions under which Amazon's workers labour. Every time we eat meat, we are allowing ourselves to forget that animals experience pain and fear and emotion. We are constantly making our deals around what we will numb ourselves to. So I often say that what my father did to me was, it's simply that I was not human to my father. But we are always allowing people to become non-human to each other. So it wasn't, so I say it's personal beef that I have with him. He just happened to not think of me as human. So that's one level of dehumanisation at my father's hands. But more urgent to me, I came to the UK 2 weeks before I turned 16. And then the second level of dehumanisation began. My realisation that as a Pakistani woman in the West, I would never be admitted, and a woman of Muslim origin specifically, my humanity would always be in question. If, when push came to shove, my humanity would always be one of the first to be treated as disposable. And I came to understand how my father's strange behaviour was rooted in Anglophilia, not in his Muslimness, but in Anglophilia, in his sense that British culture was superior, Pakistani culture was inferior, his desire to optimise us in very Western terms of goodness and quality, and that was a hangover of Pakistan's broader post-colonial trauma, of the consequences of the way that Pakistan and Muslim culture during the empire was sort of denigrated, minimised, dismissed, prevented from full realisation on their terms. And that Pakistan's founding, which is still so recent, it's still within the last 100 years, Pakistan has never been fully able, because of the circumstances of its creation, and tremendous violence attended the creation of Pakistan. Tremendous communal violence due to the haste and the sloppiness of the British withdrawal. Pakistan's been in a state of kind of post-colonial crisis ever since. And the consequence of that is a sort of identity crisis. And that, I think, lay at the root of my father's behaviour towards us. And I am a tremendous believer in apportioning blame where blame is due. And that doesn't mean forgiving my father, but it means being able to put his behaviour in a broader context. And so one of the things I say in the book is, I don't blame my father, but I don't forgive him either. And I think there's something important in terms of, it's important to me to be fair, and it's also important to me to respect the experiences I've had. And I think there's much more grey space to allow that to happen than sometimes we think. Things don't have to be black and white. We can say he was the product of his circumstances, but also he behaved to me in a way that I choose not to forgive.
Touching on the post-colonial history that Pakistan is still grappling with, in the book you write so succinctly and aptly that in the absence of concrete answers, modern Pakistan is constructed on acts of exclusion which are both extremely strict and extremely vague. Its instabilities, its coups, its wars, its various violences derive in many ways from the fact that no one can feel with confidence that they belong in Pakistan. It was no wonder really that you had no sense of how to connect with other people. Stuck in its own post-colonial drift, Pakistan had never been able to work out either what it meant to belong. And it's so true. I mean, the magic of this book and your writing and your work is that you relate to the colonial histories of Pakistan, the struggle it's gone through, and the struggle that you experience in relation to other people with your PTSD, and your connection to land and landscapes. I just wonder there, what role do you think trauma plays in shaping our connections? Even relating to colonial histories, you write, flat landscapes are landscapes we think of as other. In our Western paradigms, we think of them as spaces between landscapes. There's nothing to look at there. I wonder if you can touch on that.
Yeah, so the word trauma is a really interesting one to me. I teach a course at Bristol called Literature and Trauma, and to second-year undergraduates. We always start by thinking about the origins of the word trauma, how it was in its origins a medico-legal concept to do with who, after accidents on the railways in Victorian Britain, who got financial compensation and who was denied it. Is it a mental problem or a physical one? So it's deeply rooted in its origins in this sort of Western capitalist history. And so I constantly go back and forth on how useful a term to me trauma is, or rather, what the limits of the concept of trauma might be. Because the way that we often talk about trauma in the West certainly is that it's a kind of, the consequence is it makes you a less productive citizen, and you need to heal in order to kind of be an optimized human being. And this idea of an optimized human is one I feel really uncertain about and really suspicious of, I think. And I think that a better world would allow people not to be optimized, would allow people to live good lives, even unoptimized. And so I think this is a kind of the reason I hold the term complex PTSD slightly gingerly. I think that only a society that didn't necessarily value the collective, that traded only in terms of the individual and the individual's responsibility to fix themselves or to think differently about their past or to recover. Yeah, only a society like that would use that term. So then I wonder whether as a better way would be to think in terms of the collective, that our very institutions are broken. I used an epigraph to one of my chapters, a tremendous essay by the feminist psychotherapist Laura Brown. And this isn't the quotation I use, but the quotation that I always think of is, what would happen, and I'm paraphrasing badly, if we were to admit that our society is a factory for the production of so many walking wounded? It is, if you are at all marginalised in this society, you experience ongoing, unending, insidious trauma. If you're a woman, if you're a person of colour, if you're disabled, if you're working class, if you're queer, if you're trans, if you're from the global south, if your first language isn't English, the number of people in this society who are untraumatized becomes a tiny minority. So we are then, if everybody is traumatized, we need a better term and we need a better framework than that of individual trauma. Does that make sense?
Absolutely. And on this concept of belief versus understanding, you previously said that in writing this book, in writing about your life in trauma, you had this unique experience of expressing yourself and being believed that you never had before in your life. And I think separately you wrote in the book, supposedly trauma transcends language and time and is therefore untellable. Perhaps sometimes it is, but I think traumatized people do know how to tell their stories. What's difficult is that people don't know how to hear them. I wonder if you can speak on reconciling with the idea of telling stories of trauma on the micro, macro, meso level, the personal versus population. Like you said, ultimately, it seems that we are all to a level traumatized, but you've written your account of trauma in such a way that intersects all these scales.
Yeah, I've been wanting to tell this story since it was happening to me, since I was 14 or so. I made one attempt at 14 and abandoned it, made another attempt at 30 when I fell in love, and I just felt that I could not make myself understood by the person I loved. Because whenever I tried to talk about what was happening to me, so in Pakistan it was dismissed as, oh, this is just normal, or don't make a fuss, or you complain so much. And I didn't tell half of the things that were happening to me, but every time I made any kind of bid to describe how I felt, that was the response. And then when I came to the UK, the response generally to any kind of account of my life was, but isn't that just what things are like in Pakistan? And it was I could not explain the oddness of a life where terror was chronic, even though it did not always show up in concrete terms. The terror came from all the things that were unknown, that were hidden, that we only saw in glimpses, that were hinted at, that were threatened. I remember that much more than the violence. The episodes of violence, such as they were, are so basically irrelevant to me. What I remember were the things for which I had no language and no way of expressing how terrible they felt to me. That was the horror, and I couldn't make anyone listen or believe me or understand. It wasn't that people didn't, well, I don't know whether people often couldn't hear me. That was the interesting thing. Like, I'd tell people, I remember as a younger person, about my life and when I came to Britain and what happened, and then they would kind of forget it. I think because it just didn't fit their sense of what a brown woman's story should look like. People can't hear what they don't expect to hear. I find that over and over again, like almost they physically can't hear it. They can't remember it. They can't store it. We are just terrible at listening to each other. Just in general, we're terrible at taking in and digesting the unexpected. Much as we think we want novelty, we really don't seem to. And so when I got this opportunity to write the book, supported by an agent, a white man, I never thought I'd work with him, and then supported by an editor who was also white, but having the experience throughout of being completely believed on my terms and respected and supported, to arrange this strange account into a book. Because I felt like it wasn't a proper story even. It didn't have a kind of climax that I could tell people about. There didn't seem to be proper events in it. It was just a kind of chronic feeling. And I felt like it wasn't a story and it was untellable. But to be supported to form it into a book in the way that it needed to take shape. And then to have the privilege of having the events turned from something that pervaded me and poisoned me and paralyzed me, to turn them into a sheaf of paper. That has been the blessing of my life. I cannot believe I got this lucky. I think I might be the luckiest person I know. I'm certainly the luckiest Pakistani woman I know. To have readers read it and believe me. Readers, the response from women of colour has been heartbreakingly moving, and I'm so grateful. But I also got a message from somebody that read something like, I am a straight, cis white man from age 67 from Canada, and I couldn't be more different than you. And yet when I read the book, something in it resonated with me. To feel less, I have realised that the experiences which made me feel so utterly different were shared. And what a privilege that has been.
I think there's something radical in recognizing the bonds that we share, as you say. It's a sort of lie we tell ourselves at the time that we're alone in this sort of personal grief that we've gone through, whereas it seems to be much of the same shared human experience. I wanted to also talk on the concept of visibility and awareness.
Yeah.
You've touched on the idea that flat landscapes can simultaneously reveal and obscure truths. And you've identified this sort of knowledge of paradox, or rather paradox of knowledge around flat landscapes, where flat landscapes seem to be contradictory because it hides nothing, because you can see everything for miles, and it shows you nothing. But if it hides nothing, it should show you everything, and yet it doesn't show you anything, seemingly. And then you say this raises questions about the West's capacity to not see what's in front of its eyes. I wonder if you can speak on that.
Yeah, absolutely. So it's just as you say, that there's a complete openness about a flat landscape where you can see for miles, nothing's hidden, everything is right there. And yet, ironically, it's that total openness, which means that we, as I mentioned earlier in this podcast, we don't know how to look at it. We don't know how to process and organise what we are seeing. And that says so much about how we are only, as I mentioned, we don't know how to listen to each other. We don't know how to absorb stories that don't follow the pattern we expect them to follow. There's a very particular narrative that we have of what a brown woman's life should be, promulgated by dreadful misery memoirs and sort of like racist accounts, essentially, and racist right-wing narratives. And it means that anything that doesn't guide, any kind of narrative that doesn't follow that pattern is almost unhearable. Any space which we have not been pre-trained to learn how to move through, we just don't know how to relate to. And so there is a way, I'm always interested in the way that if you're a woman of colour, you can say something, and so I can only speak to being a woman of colour, and I'm certain it is the same for people of colour. Perhaps it is particularly the case for women of colour. If you're a person of colour, you can say things as clearly and plainly and urgently as you like, as many times as you like, and people still will not hear you. Or they will confidently summarise what you said completely. And that's interesting to me, that I think that I come to the point where it's just a question of accepting that we are as human beings basically unhearable. For the most part, we are unable to hear each other because we're always looking through a kind of cloud of our own assumptions and perceptions and cultural framings. So how do we survive that, right? Like, we know that we need as human beings to feel connected. And what we normally think is that we need to feel seen. I wonder increasingly if there's a power in not being seen, or the kind of more important than being seen, I think, is to be believed. And I think of this in terms of my relationship with my trans friends. I am a cis woman. I can never understand what people say when they say, you know, the gender I was assigned is not my gender. There is something fundamental which, you know, if you're at home in your gender, you can just never imagine what it might be like to not feel at home. So my job, we've got two options there. One option is to say, I don't understand, I can't relate to it, and therefore it's nonsense what you're saying. And that's obviously a terrible option. But it's the option I see so many people choose, because we have this idea that empathy and in other words, being able to feel what other people should feel should be the kind of basic heuristic for who gets our support. If we can feel empathy with them, then they are deserving of help and allyship. But what we need to do, in fact, is to say, I do not understand you, but I believe you. I believe you, and I will listen to you, and I will trust you. And I think that is, if we can never hear each other, if we can never understand each other, then we should at least try and believe each other.
Just looking at how you've then related this radical idea of redefining empathy to loving in a flat way, you write, empathy is overrated. Empathy says, I feel exactly what you're feeling, I understand what you're feeling, I'm there with you. But you want to see a new model of solidarity, which you say is a sort of flat solidarity. It's in the same way that we think to love someone, we have to sort of dig under the surface to understand them and see who they really are. But also in the same way, politically, for people that we think of as the other, we need to seemingly have this incisive gaze to figure out what their intentions are, who they are, analyze them. But what we really need is people from other cultures to say, I don't understand you. Your worldview is totally different from mine. I am so different from you, but I have solidarity with you. Let's just love in a perfectly flat way. I think it's so incredibly beautiful and radical. I think there's also something there about language as activism too. You've said primarily this book is about the dehumanization of your story, but then also the dehumanization of brown bodies. And I wonder if you can touch on that. Of course, in the book, you talk about post-colonial histories and the deaths, horrors, despairs, and deprivation of brown bodies, minoritized bodies, particularly in the makeup of historical landscapes across Britain, Scotland, the British Isles. But even beyond, you've said that you can't help but talk about Gaza when you're promoting this book.
So my book came out in 2023, and in April 2023, and months later, the 7th October occurred, and since then, the genocide in Gaza has been. I have been unable to think about my books without thinking about the genocide. And what has been very strange to me, what has been surreal, is people who said to me, "Oh, I love your book, I really respect it," who then will sort of say in the same breath, "But like, do you really need to say anything about Gaza?" I've had speaking opportunities cancelled. I've had writing opportunities. When I intimated that I would not be able, I start every event that I do making the link between the dehumanisation of brown bodies and what is happening in Gaza. And one of the things that has caused me a tremendous amount of grief, pain, and horror is what it's shown me that people in this publishing world, I don't mean certainly in the world of publishing, but in the whole economy of readers and the ways that we think about books, what people want from books by people like me. People want books that will make them feel in a general way, yeah, racism is bad, I'm not racist, that's great. They do not want to actually change anything about the world. They truly don't. They are broadly happy with the world as it is, maybe with a brown or a black character on an extra one in a film or something. That's great. For them, that's racism solved. But our world is built on colonial relationships, not just the colonial relationships that formally ended in the last few decades, but the ongoing colonial relationships of this world. And the most egregious example is Gaza. It is an extraordinary, brain-breaking act of colonial violence that has been ongoing for decades and decades and decades. And the reluctance in so much of the publishing world to acknowledge that, to accommodate it, to respond to it as a legitimate point, or to see themselves as in any way responsible for it or in any way complicit in it, is staggering to me. So I'm a member of a collective called Fossil Free Books, which uses our leverage. We're a collective of book workers, and we use our leverage in the books industry to put pressure on institutions which fund or invest in genocidal infrastructures in the Middle East. So places like things like Meta, things like Nvidia, the AI structures that are used to bomb civilians in Gaza. And we put pressure on Baillie Gifford, who was the funder of many book festivals in the UK, to put pressure on Baillie Gifford to divest. And the number of people who said to us, "Oh, you're book burners, you hate literary culture. Books are so important. Books change the world." And I'm like, you're just showing me that you don't want books to change the world. I've written a book about colonialism and the dehumanisation of brown bodies. Do you really expect me not to act upon it when it comes home? When it shows up in the world that we live in? Do you expect me to think that my book and publicising my book is more important than doing whatever I can, whatever tiny, trivial thing I can, to put a spanner in the works of genocide? Do you really think that any book festival is more important than the lives of babies? And do you know, I think deep down, the majority... People think that being able to go to a field in the sunshine and drink cider and feel good about their own reading habits, they think that's the most important thing. And that has been devastating for me. Because I take very seriously, when I say a book can change the world, I mean that I think the value of a book is to move you to down tools, to abandon everything you thought was important, and to change the world with every bit of power that you've got. If a book just makes you feel makes you think, oh, that's interesting, forget it. I don't care about writing that sort of book, and I don't care about that kind of moving someone.
There's something there about occupying the same space, but having a completely, radically different reality to one another. The sentence on my mind is, "This earth is too small to meet mass barbarity with indifference. We stand on soil that is raised to rubble for others. We breathe the same air that is saturated by others' horrors. We have bonds of humanity." And yet, there's privilege, there's positionality, there's coloniality that obscures our shared human experience and creates bubbles of alternate other realities. And we're all just passing through with radically different experiences of our world. And when you puncture that through the vector, through the medium of literature, that is that moment of awkwardness, this realization where they don't want to have that reconciliation.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And it is surreal to be in that space. And it is surreal to work. It is just... And then my question of how we build relationships in that situation becomes even more urgent, and even more inexorable for me. I feel stymied.
People listening might think we've gone off track, but I think this is quite integral, even as the future generation of the health service, as future doctors, nurses, allied healthcare professionals. We've been pushed into this awkward hypocrisy.
Yeah.
I go into anatomy class and I'm told to revere this cadaver in front of me, as I rightly should. There's the Human Tissue Act that codifies into law to respect this body in front of me, and even the smallest parts of its body in front of me in the anatomy class. And in that same class, I'm breaking vertebrae as part of the exercise, and I'm breaking this vertebrae. And as soon as I step out of this class, I flip between vignettes of bodies slashed and maimed, and through horrifying calculation have weapons of war designed to literally, in every sense, dehumanize, destroy, and dismember bodies that we see. And even in the world of medicine, we can't seem to reconcile it. Who do I see as human, as you say? And it's central to the book that you've written, and it's central to the reality that we're currently living in. Who do we afford to see as humans?
Absolutely. And I think, how can we be sane in this world? What would it mean to be healed in a world that requires us to operate on these completely irreconcilable levels of reality at the same time as racialized people, and also as just thinking people, as people who seek and admire coherence, as people who need things to be coherent, and who aren't happy with doublethink or with just sort of mentally relegating whole sections of reality. And I think it's one of the, again, we come back to the question of, is trauma a personal problem? Like, if I don't, and I say in the book, I do not want to be okay with such a wicked world. I do not want to be at home in it. I do not want to belong to it. It is right and it is good that it should feel horrifying and alien and unacceptable to me. I never want to feel okay with it. Because that to me is a particular kind of wild, that thing that we think of as normal, to just be like, yeah, I know, just get on with your day. The most important thing is that you function in this world. This world is not functioning for us. This is a non-functioning world. It is not an acceptable request to ask me to function within it. One of the things I loved about the therapist who I described working with in the book, I would always come in and be like, okay, I need to be more like this and this and this. This is my strategy to deal with this. And she would just sit there, and she was white. She was a queer woman, which I think helped tailor her response to me. But she would say to me, well, but also what you're describing is racism, and you don't have to be okay with racism. It's not your job to cope well with racism. It's the job of the world to stop being racist. And yeah, that's right. How does therapy, and that's such a good example of how therapeutic practice can, rather than being like, how do we fix you? That's how therapeutic practice can affirm your reality and say, you're not defective for reacting with distress to a distressing situation.
Absolutely. I mean, that's so obvious and yet perhaps so healing to hear, and I guess validating and affirming your experience, like you say. Just going back to language and the role of language in activism, you write, I feel a great hopelessness about language in the face of this conflict about Gaza. Our writing is not enough. What is needed is for us to be humans in a basic way. And I see the people in power enduring and excusing and explaining away and denying and minimizing it. Any faith I had in the world or trust I had in the world is gone. I don't know how to write in the face of that. This passage, I don't think it's nihilism, because nihilism is an awkward reaction to have, perhaps. This is, like you say, an inevitable, appropriate reaction to the horror that we're seeing. And then there's this twinned dehumanization of language that permeates generally. You know, it's the ambient background noise that's been amplified through this genocide, whether it's phrases like crisis in the Middle East, as if it's a diffuse distal occurrence, intractable, insoluble, inevitable, and they're doomed for it, and we are here in the West just passive observers of this natural occurrence.
Yes, exactly, because brown people will fight and brown people will die. And that's just how the world is, rather than an atrocity that human beings are making decisions about and allowing to continue and funding to continue. Sorry, I interrupted.
No, exactly. And the other example I think of and realize, even coming of age as a brown British Pakistani boy in the West, there's this concept of Islamism too, radical Islam, and the fact that Islam and the religion I consider to be a way in which makes sense of the world as I observe it, the world around me, just as a codified way of life, and the only difference between that and a radical perversion of it is 3 letters, ISM. Otherwise, it's rooted apparently in that form of language, in the ideologies, and yet I believe that the ideology of Islam disavows it. But Islamism, even phonetically and the physical drawing of the word, seems to be rooted as an extension of Islam.
It's these distortions of language, these, as you say, these perversions of language, and perversions of, and exploitations of good and beautiful things. Agonizingly painful. So, I'm going to read from so every chapter in Flat Place is based around a walk that I do in one of Britain's flat landscapes. And this is the final, a reading from the final walk that I do with my mother. And so this is the first walk I do with my mother, and it follows several years of a kind of difficult relationship with my mother after I couldn't really understand. Whenever I tried to talk to my mother about what had happened to us in Pakistan, she'd say, oh, it wasn't that bad, was it? Oh, and she didn't seem to remember a lot of things that I remembered, or she didn't want to admit them. And it really came between us. I felt unable to relate to her or to be authentic with her. So we go on this walk, and I was really thinking of the walk as this is a sort of a moment where I decide how we manage our relationship going forward. Maybe it will become clear from this walk and this time spent together that we maybe need to step back from the relationship and have a little break from one another, or perhaps it will change or shift things. So I went to Orkney with my mother, and we were there for a week. And during this time, I was asking her questions about her childhood, the way that she related to her childhood, and she would say things just consistently, like, nothing happened to me. She would always say, oh, nothing happened to me. Everything, I had a fine time. It was fine. And yet, some of the things that happened to her when she was 13 years old, her 17-year-old brother found her father hanging dead in their shed. Or their garage, I can't remember which it was. She lost a parent very young. She was incredible. What she describes being very, what we would now call neglect. She describes various terrifying experiences, and yet is still able to say, oh yeah, nothing happened to me. And one of the things that transformed my relationship with my mother, which I'm going to sort of intimate in the reading I'm about to do, I really needed my mother at one point to say, no, I had a terrible time. I think I'm probably traumatized. But I came to understand, actually, on that walk in Orkney, that this was just not a language that felt available to her. It was not a language that felt that it applied. It was not part of her framework or her way of seeing the world. And actually, my need for her to inhabit my framework of looking at the world, which is to do with trauma, was a way of trying to get power over her. And actually, what I needed to do was to just sit alongside her reality, to understand that it wasn't a fight, it wasn't a competition whose reality wins out, but just that we might have two separate and distinct frameworks for looking at the world, and they can survive. And once I accepted that, things began to shift. So in this reading, we've just arrived at the standing stones of Stennes, which is a stone circle on Orkney, even older than Stonehenge. The grey stones stood like huge, gentle, awkward men, wide-shouldered, hunching round slightly, who had lost their arms somewhere. 3 tall ones and a jaunty small one, which changed direction halfway along its length, bending the other way to make a corner. One of the myths which hangs over Orkney is that the standing stones leave their place at Hogmanay and go down to the loch to drink. I could see in my mind the kind, worried stones twisting their big shoulders right down with great difficulty to try to get their mouths to the water level for a sip. Another stone lay flat on the ground, with smaller stones balanced upright nearby. The quiet was complete. Little wisps of sheep wool had caught in the cracks and scars of the rock. They fluttered in the wind. Outside the stone field, the grass flowed and rippled, shining like clean hair. What are Britain's stone circles for? They were used for ritual purposes. That's an old archaeologist's joke. If you don't know what a monument or artefact was for, you say it had ritual purposes. Looking at my mother's Orkney guidebook, though, I kept thinking of a tweet I'd seen, saying that if an archaeologist dug up Disneyland, they would without hesitation classify it as a religious site. We use such poor, narrow, clumsy categories to try to grasp the unknown. Difference is difficult to truly imagine. Who says that the stone circles were even monuments at all? The archaeologist Colin Richards suggests, rather than being built solely as ritual or ceremonial centres, it may have been the actual acts of construction that provided the main social focus. People would have gathered to watch and participate, with stones perhaps being added slowly over time. Perhaps it was the type of stones that mattered. Maybe they were from a sacred place. Perhaps the point was not a symbolic ring to unify society, but a competitive process of quarrying and transportation. It's one mental step to establish that people in the past or in other countries were or are, quote-unquote, just like us. That's an easy act of generosity, which is really more like narcissism. It's quite another thing to grasp that their thinking, their priorities, their assumptions might be utterly different from ours, unimaginable and unreachable. And yet, At the same time, this is the leap, to understand viscerally that they were still just as human. Our own minds are not the measure of what is worthwhile.
Thank you so much, Noreen. To close this conversation, I would love to ask you what you would like the reader to leave with reading your work. I know part of it you previously mentioned was about the radical idea of flat empathy, but perhaps for two sorts of readers. First, the general reader, but secondly, the reader that is working in healthcare, that is working within trauma. And maybe you don't differentiate between the two. As you say, in essence, we're all traumatized to a degree, in some way, in some paradigm, and in some form.
It's such a lovely question. No one has ever asked me that. What would I like people working in healthcare to take away from the book? I've had a set of very mixed experiences in healthcare. I've had some tremendously good healthcare experiences, and I've had some terrible ones. The terrible ones have taken this form again and again, where I talk about what I am facing, and they say, well, that is not possible, or that we have, that is not what we understand to be the case, therefore this conversation is over. And it's so for instance, when I had chronic pain, I continue to have chronic pain of various kinds, and I would say, well, this seems to cause my pain, and they were like, no, well, all the research says that's not the case. It is a very simple thing and a very difficult thing, particularly with the financial and time constraints upon the National Health Service. But it is to understand that there may be stories or accounts that do not fit with what we believe to be possible, and to take them on their terms, and to start from a position of belief. Whenever someone has done that to me or with me, that in itself has been a powerfully healing thing, if healing is possible. It has made life feel more bearable, or like it has some hope. To feel outside of story, to feel unassimilable into narrative, to an extent it's a necessary thing to come to terms with. But if it is the only experience you ever have, you feel like you do not exist, like you have no reality. There is a real feeling if you're a post-colonial subject of any kind, that there is a story, and it is a white story. And if your story does not coincide with the white story, you are not real. And it's a very simple thing, to be open to possibility, to be open to things that seem impossible. But it is a tremendously hard thing to do.
Can I just ask, in what ways have you noticed, and in what ways has it stood out that people have started from a position of belief, championed your voice, and resisted against the industrialization that hushes the patient voice rather than listens to it?
Well, a very moving example recently was when I've recently been diagnosed with hypermobility. I described things to my physiotherapist, and she said, yeah, like, oh, I've never heard it described like that before. Show me. I've never seen that before. Show me. And then she said, it just involved the hardest thing, right? Which is to spend time and to listen and to say, well, I've never seen that before, but, that is obviously a real problem for you. Let us think about what might alleviate this obviously very real problem, even if I don't understand what's going on. And it's such a simple thing, but it's such a rare thing.